A black homeless veteran finds himself in the dock on misdemeanor charges. But what is revealed in court shocks everyone in attendance. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching from. The biting wind howled through the narrow city streets, cutting through layers of clothing and chilling anyone unfortunate enough to be outside. Darius Watson sat slumped against the wall of a shuttered store, his back pressed against the cold, graffitied bricks. The sidewalk bustled with pedestrians, their coats wrapped tightly around them as they hurried past him, eyes fixed on their destinations. Darius was invisible to them, a shadow among the cracks of society. The corner he had claimed for the night was small, but shielded from the worst of the wind. A tattered, military-issued backpack rested beside him, its seams stretched to their limits by the few belongings he still owned. His hands, calloused and cracked from years of hardship, worked to tighten the frayed scarf around his neck. The scarf had been a gift from his late mother, a bright red streak that now stood out like a flag of defiance against the gray monotony of his existence. Darius shifted uncomfortably, the ache in his joints refusing to be ignored. His body bore the marks of a life spent fighting battles both abroad and at home. The scars on his hands and arms told stories of war, but the deeper wounds, the ones no one could see, were etched into his mind. Those scars throbbed now, brought to life by the cold and the weight of isolation. Once, Darius had walked these same streets with pride. He had been Sergeant Darius Watson of the 82nd Airborne Division, a man respected by his peers and admired by his community. He had worn his uniform with dignity, the patches and medals on his chest a testament to his courage. But all of that seemed like a distant memory, almost as if it had happened to someone else. Now, people barely looked at him, and when they did, it was with a mix of pity and disdain. The memories were relentless. They came unbidden, sweeping over him like waves. He remembered the missions overseas, the camaraderie of his unit, and the moments of unimaginable bravery. But he also remembered the long nights filled with the sound of gunfire and the haunting cries of his fallen brothers in arms. War had taken pieces of him, pieces he would never get back. When he returned home, he had expected to find solace in the familiar. Instead, he was met with indifference. His old neighborhood was unrecognizable, the faces he once knew now strangers. His friends had moved on, their lives untouched by the chaos he had endured. Even his family, once his anchor, seemed to drift away. His wife, tired of his silence and the darkness that had taken hold of him, had left, taking their 2 children with her. The promises made to him as a veteran, promises of stability, support, and gratitude, proved hollow. The job he had been assured of never materialized, and the bills began to pile up. One by one, the threads of his life unraveled until he found himself here, on the streets, forgotten by the country he had served. As the day turned to evening, the bustling street began to thin out. The warm lights of the nearby cafe spilled onto the sidewalk, offering a fleeting sense of comfort. Darius eyed the cafe longingly. He could almost feel the warmth of the coffee, taste its bitter relief. But he knew better than to go inside. The last time he had tried, the manager had glared at him, his disdain unmistakable. Darius had left before any words were exchanged, his dignity barely intact. That dignity was all he had left now, and he clung to it fiercely. Even when people tossed a few coins his way, he refused to let them see him grovel. He would nod in gratitude, but never reach out his hand too eagerly. To them, he might have been just another homeless man, but to himself, he was still Sergeant Watson, a man who had once stood tall even in the face of gunfire. Night fell and the temperature dropped further. Darius huddled deeper into his coat, a worn relic of his military days. The coat had seen him through desert storms and jungle rains, but now it struggled to fend off the biting chill of the city. He shifted his position, trying to ease the stiffness in his legs when a pair of boots stopped in front of him. "Hey, man," a voice said, hesitant but kind. Darius looked up to see a young man holding out a cup of coffee. The man's face was framed by a scarf, his eyes filled with something Darius hadn't seen in a long time: compassion. "For you," the young man said, placing the cup beside Darius before hurrying away. Darius stared at the cup, the steam rising in delicate tendrils. A small gesture, but one that brought a lump to his throat. He picked it up carefully, cradling it in his hands as if it were something precious. For a moment, the warmth spread through his fingers and into his chest, a fleeting reminder of what it felt like to be human. But the moment didn't last. The peace was shattered when a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey, you can't stay here!" Darius looked up to see a man in a tailored coat standing a few feet away, glaring at him. The man gestured angrily toward the cafe. "You're scaring off customers. Move along." Darius sighed and began gathering his things. He was used to this, being treated like a nuisance, a blemish on the polished image of the city. He stood slowly, his knees protesting with every movement. But as he turned to leave, the man stepped closer, his voice rising. "You people don't belong here," he spat, the venom in his words unmistakable. The cafe manager had noticed the commotion and hurried outside, his expression tight with disapproval. "I've already told you before," the manager said, addressing Darius directly. "This is private property. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the police." Darius nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't argue. Years of discipline had taught him to follow orders without question. But the weight of the man's words lingered, cutting deeper than the cold ever could. Minutes later, the police arrived. The officer was young, his uniform crisp and his demeanor professional. "Sir, you can't stay here," he said firmly but not unkindly. "We've had complaints." Darius didn't resist. He picked up his belongings and prepared to leave, but the officer stopped him. "Wait," he said, his tone softening. "I'm sorry, but I have to take you in. It's protocol." The walk to the police car was slow and heavy, each step a reminder of how far Darius had fallen. As the city lights blurred past the car window, he felt the familiar weight of despair settle over him. For Darius, this was just another night in a life that had become a series of endless battles he was no longer sure he could win. The metal bench was cold against Darius Watson's back as he sat in the holding cell, his arms crossed tightly over his chest in a futile attempt to keep warm. He stared at the faded gray walls, his mind swimming with a mixture of anger, shame, and exhaustion. The cell smelled of stale air and disinfectant, its corners littered with scratches and graffiti from previous occupants. This wasn't his first night in a holding cell, but it was the first time in years that he allowed himself to think about how far he had fallen. How had it come to this? How had the proud sergeant of the 82nd Airborne, who had once led men through enemy fire, ended up here, treated like a common criminal? The officer who brought him in had been kind enough, but even kindness felt like pity when it was handed to him in the form of protocol. Darius's arrest was another reminder of how invisible he was to the world, how quickly people wrote him off as just another homeless man, another statistic, another burden. He pulled his coat tighter around him, his fingers brushing the worn patch on his shoulder. The faint outline of his old unit insignia was barely visible now, its edges frayed and faded from years of wear. That patch had once been a symbol of honor, a mark of the family he had found in his unit. Now it was a relic of a life that felt impossibly distant. The hours dragged on, the dim light in the cell flickering intermittently. Darius leaned his head back against the wall, his eyes closing as the memories crept in. The first time he had donned his uniform, he had felt a surge of pride so strong it brought tears to his eyes. His mother had been there, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched her son graduate from basic training. She had called him her hero, the man who would carry their family's name with dignity and courage. For years, he had lived up to that promise. His time in the service was filled with moments of triumph and heartbreak, of camaraderie and loss. He had been a leader, someone his unit could depend on when everything else fell apart. But when the war ended and his service was done, the return home had been nothing like he imagined. The battles didn't stop, they just changed form. The battlefield became the job market, where his military experience was deemed irrelevant. The enemy became the unyielding bureaucracy that denied him the benefits he had earned. And the wounds he carried were no longer physical, but emotional. Scars that no one could see, but that bled all the same. His wife, Angela, had tried to understand at first. She had stayed by his side as he struggled to find work, as the nightmares kept him awake and the weight of everything he had seen and done began to crush him. But eventually, her patience ran out. One day, she packed her things, took their 2 children, and left. Darius hadn't fought her decision. He couldn't. He knew she deserved more than the broken man he had become. That was the beginning of the end. Without his family, without a job, and without the structure the military had given his life, he spiraled into a darkness he couldn't escape. He lost his home, his belongings, and finally, his sense of self. A loud clang jolted him back to the present. The cell door opened, and a guard stepped in. "Watson," he called, "you've got a hearing in the morning. Get some rest." Darius nodded silently, though rest was the last thing on his mind. He lay down on the hard bench, his coat serving as a makeshift pillow. Sleep came in brief, uneasy bursts, interrupted by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echoes of other detainees. By morning, he was groggy but composed. A different guard escorted him to the courthouse, where he was handed over to a bailiff. The courthouse was a stark contrast to the holding cell, clean, bright, and filled with people who barely glanced in his direction. Darius sat on a bench outside the courtroom, waiting for his name to be called. His mismatched clothing, a worn military jacket over a pair of jeans that didn't quite fit, drew a few curious looks from the other attendees. Most of them seemed more interested in whispering amongst themselves, their eyes sliding past him as if he were a part of the furniture. When the courtroom doors opened, Darius was led inside. The room was large but uninviting, its wood-paneled walls and high ceiling doing little to mask the tension that filled the air. He took a seat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The judge entered, and everyone rose. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority that commanded respect. Her nameplate read Honorable Evelyn Harper. Darius noticed how her gaze swept across the room, taking in every detail before she sat down and called the court to order. One by one, the cases were presented. Darius listened as people pleaded their innocence, their voices filled with desperation or defiance. He felt a pang of solidarity with some of them, though their stories were worlds apart from his own. Finally, his name was called. Darius Watson, Judge Harper said, her voice firm but not unkind. Darius stood slowly, his back straight despite the weight of the moment. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. The judge began reading through his file, her brow furrowing slightly as she skimmed the details. "You're charged with trespassing and loitering," she said. "Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied. As she continued to read, her expression changed. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she read a particular line. Then she looked up, her gaze settling on Darius with newfound interest. "Mr. Watson," she said slowly, "it says here that you're a veteran. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "What branch did you serve in?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "The Army, ma'am," Darius replied. 82nd Airborne Division." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. The judge's eyes softened, and she leaned back in her chair. "The 82nd Airborne," she repeated, almost to herself. Then she looked at him again, her voice quieter but filled with emotion. "My father served in the same division. He used to tell us stories about a man who saved his life during a firefight. That man's name was Darius Watson." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as heads turned toward Darius. He felt the weight of their gazes, but kept his own fixed on the judge. "That was me, ma'am," he said quietly. "I just did my duty." Judge Harper nodded, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she straightened and addressed the courtroom. "This man," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is not just another case on our docket. He is a veteran who served this country with honor and courage. The fact that he stands here today, facing charges for seeking shelter, is a failure not of his character, but of our society." She turned back to Darius, her tone softening. "Mr. Watson, I am dismissing these charges. Furthermore, I am ordering immediate assistance to ensure you receive the support you deserve as a veteran." Darius's chest tightened, and he swallowed hard. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not as a burden, but as a person who mattered. The courtroom was emptying, but Darius Watson remained seated at the defendant's table, his hands resting on his lap. He felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The words of Judge Harper echoed in his mind. "This is a failure, not of your character, but of our society." For so long, Darius had carried the weight of blame on his shoulders, believing he was solely responsible for the downward spiral of his life. But now, for the first time in years, someone had seen him. Not as a homeless man or a problem to be dealt with, but as a human being who had once been a hero. Judge Harper's dismissal of his case wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moment of profound change. As the bailiff approached to escort him out of the courtroom, Darius turned to the judge one last time. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Outside the courtroom, a representative from the Veterans Outreach Program waited for him. She was a petite woman in her early 40s, dressed in a tailored blazer with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her name was Lisa, and she greeted Darius with a warm smile. "Mr. Watson?" she asked, extending a hand. "I'm Lisa Howard with the Veterans Outreach Program. Judge Harper contacted us about your case. We'd like to help." Darius hesitated before shaking her hand. It had been a long time since someone had offered him help without an ulterior motive. "What kind of help?" he asked cautiously. "Let's start with getting you some temporary housing," Lisa said. "From there, we'll work on connecting you with counseling services, job training, and anything else you might need to get back on your feet." The words sounded too good to be true, but something in Lisa's demeanor reassured him. She wasn't just going through the motions. She genuinely wanted to help. For the first time in years, Darius felt a flicker of hope. Lisa escorted Darius to a transitional housing center on the outskirts of the city. The building was modest but clean, with freshly painted walls and simple furnishings. The staff greeted him warmly, their smiles free of the judgment he had grown accustomed to. They showed him to a small room with a twin bed, a wooden desk, and a window that overlooked a courtyard. Darius set his backpack down on the bed, running his fingers over the soft blanket. It had been years since he had slept in a bed that wasn't in a shelter or under the open sky. The thought brought a lump to his throat, but he pushed it down. He wasn't used to letting himself feel vulnerable. Over the next few days, the staff at the center helped Darius settle in. They provided him with clean clothes, warm meals, and a sense of stability that had been absent from his life for so long. Lisa visited regularly, checking in on his progress and making sure he felt supported. One afternoon, she brought him to a group therapy session for veterans. The room was filled with men and women of all ages, each with their own stories of struggle and survival. At first, Darius was hesitant to share. He listened as others spoke about their experiences, their voices heavy with pain and resilience. Slowly, he began to feel a sense of camaraderie, a reminder of the brotherhood he had once known in the military. When it was his turn to speak, Darius hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he looked around the room. "I'm not sure where to start," he admitted. "It's been a long time since I've talked about any of this." One of the older men in the group nodded encouragingly. "Take your time," he said. "We're here to listen." Darius took a deep breath and began to share his story. He talked about his time in the service, the challenges he faced after returning home, and the struggles that had led him to the streets. As he spoke, the weight he had carried for so long began to lift. The group listened without judgment, their understanding nods and quiet words of encouragement reminding him that he wasn't alone. As weeks turned into months, Darius began to rebuild his life piece by piece. The Transitional Housing Center provided him with a stable foundation, and the Veterans Outreach Program helped him access resources he hadn't known were available. He attended counseling sessions, where he worked through the trauma that had haunted him for years. He also participated in job training workshops, gaining skills that would help him navigate the civilian workforce. One day, Lisa approached him with an opportunity. "There's a position opening up at the center," she said. "It's part-time, helping with administrative tasks and mentoring new residents. I think you'd be perfect for it." Darius was taken aback. "You think I can do that?" he asked, doubt creeping into his voice. Lisa smiled. "I know you can. You have a way of connecting with people, Darius. Your story, your strength, it inspires others." After some consideration, Darius accepted the position. At first, the work felt daunting, but as he settled into the role, he discovered a newfound sense of purpose. He became a mentor to other veterans, sharing his experiences and offering guidance to those who were just beginning their journey toward recovery. One evening, as Darius walked through the city, he passed the cafe where his troubles had begun. The manager, who had called the police, was standing outside, smoking a cigarette. Their eyes met, and the manager's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. Darius considered walking past without a word, but something stopped him. He approached the man and extended a hand. "No hard feelings," he said simply. The manager hesitated before shaking his hand. I didn't realize," he stammered. "I'm sorry for what happened." Darius nodded. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do next." Months later, Darius was invited to speak at a community event honoring veterans. Standing on the stage, he looked out at the crowd, a mix of families, officials, and fellow veterans. He felt a pang of nervousness, but pushed it aside. This was his chance to tell his story, to shed light on the challenges faced by so many like him. He spoke about his service, his struggles, and the kindness that had helped him find his way back. His words resonated with the audience, inspiring many to take action. By the end of the event, people approached him to shake his hand, thank him for his service, and offer their support. For the first time in years, Darius felt a sense of belonging. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and he was making a difference. In his new apartment, Darius hung a photograph of his old unit on the wall. It was a reminder of the brotherhood that had shaped him and the strength he had found within himself. Beside it, he placed a framed letter from Judge Harper, thanking him for his service and expressing her gratitude for his sacrifices. As he sat by the window, sipping a warm cup of coffee, Darius allowed himself to dream of brighter days ahead. The road hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, he faced the future with hope. Darius Watson was no longer defined by his struggles. He was defined by his resilience, his courage, and the community that had rallied around him. And as he watched the city lights flicker in the distance, he knew that he wasn't invisible anymore. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and explore more stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family to spread the message, and check out our other videos for more inspiring and thought-provoking content. Your support means everything. See you in the next one.